Chapter 5. Pirates? The second strange thing happened later in the day, when Mr. Penguin and his chums were sitting around the swimming pool on the upper deck, and it involved pirates. They had spent much of the morning exploring the Saucy Sandra with Mr. Chuckle. Honey Cristel joined them. She seemed in a jollier mood, but didn't say much, just smiled a lot and wafted about in a cloud of rose perfume. There was certainly a lot to see: a glittering ballroom, a games room full to the brim with every sort of board game imaginable, a library, Edith's eyes blinked wildly with wonder at this, a little theatre where Colin would be rehearsing with the choir, and of course the swimming pool. Mr. Chuckle had nattered non-stop, bursting with pride. He explained that his father and grandfather had owned lots of ships, and he'd enjoyed being on boats ever since he was a little boy. Was he mad? Wondered Mr. Penguin, casually checking that his armbands were fully inflated. And now, Mr. Chuckle had said gleefully as he tottered onto the wheelhouse where Captain Henry Cutlass, still looking quite grumpy, was manhandling the enormous wheel as easy as pie. At the grand old age of 97, I finally have my very own ship. Mr. Penguin thought that if he were a millionaire, he wouldn't buy a ship. He'd buy something nice and solid on firm ground. But Mr. Chuckle looked so giddy and pleased with himself that you couldn't help feeling happy for him. After the tour was lunch, and after lunch Mr. Penguin felt very full indeed. He'd eaten 5 fish finger sandwiches and a Knickerbocker Glory so big he'd had to stand on the table to scrape his spoon to the bottom of the glass. He'd thought about maybe spending the afternoon floating gently in the swimming pool. It wasn't very deep, but Colin had been very firm about Mr. Penguin leaving at least an hour between lunch and getting wet. So Mr. Penguin was lying flat on his back on a sun lounger, feeling bellyful and sleepy. He tilted his hat over his eyes and listened lazily to what was going on around him. It was a bit tricky to hear everything, because Colin was fast asleep on the sun lounger next to him, upside down, and rustling back and forth between pages in his notepad that said zzz and random sleepy mutterings. Colin was thoroughly enjoying his holiday. Mr. Penguin turned his attention to what was going on by the railings. Valentino Suave, Danton Air, Randolph Hunk, and Manolo Kisscurl were standing with sweaters knotted raffishly around their shoulders, looking rugged and windswept, and gazing at the great expanse of ocean. "Of course," said Manolo, squinting handsomely into the middle distance. "I'm used to being on a boat. I spent a lot of time at sea when I was a pirate." "Pirate?" Mr. Penguin opened both eyes under his hat and listened more closely. "Well, you aren't the only one," said Valentino, flicking a curl of hair out of his eyes in slow motion. "We all were pirates once, weren't we? Those were the good old days." There were murmurings of agreement from the chaps. Mr. Penguin sat up with a squeak from his rubber ring. Was he hearing things right? There were 4 pirates on board the Saucy Sandra? A familiar, nervous sort of feeling started to wobble up by his bow tie. "Yes," said Randolph, smiling his sparkly smile. "I won an award for my role as Captain Jacob Barnacle in Peril on the Poop Deck." "Well, I won several awards for my role as Black Spot Barry in Davy Jones's Damp Disaster." Then a bit of an argument broke out as each of the actors said, loudly, how much better he was than the others, and Mr. Penguin realised that they hadn't been talking about real pirates at all, just pretend ones in movies. "It does make you wonder, though," said Danton, running a hand through his luscious locks, "how much real treasure is out there. There must be tons of it buried on mysterious islands like in our movies, and I bet there's a load of the stuff at the bottom of the sea, right down there, miles below." Mr. Penguin gulped and lay very still. He didn't need reminding that he was floating along the top of some water that was probably thousands of miles deep. He decided to dip into a conversation on the other side of him, where Edith was nattering to the ladies from the Seven Sisters Choir. Gert was busy polishing her squeeze box and tuning her triangle, but her sisters were all busy ferreting about in their handbags and showing Edith photographs of the babies they looked after at Fluffy Cuddle's house, Cityville's orphanage. It was a cosy old mansion about 6 blocks from Mr. Penguin's igloo, painted baby pink, and from which came a strong whiff of nappy cream and talc. All such tiny, precious cutie pies, squeaked Miss Lavender, flipping through a book of round-faced little cherubs. In turn, Edith plucked some photographs from her bum bag of her tiny, precious cutie pie. "I've had Gordon from when he was an egg," she said, the buttons on her anorak straining as she puffed her bosom out with pride. "I hatched him myself. He's a nice little thing, flies beautifully when he gets his eyes both going in the same direction." Mr. Penguin opened his eyes to see where Gordon was. He knew his friend wasn't currently on Edith's head, which meant he was doing his own thing, which meant something weird. And sure enough, it was. Mr. Penguin watched as Gordon waddled along the edge of the swimming pool, stopping every few moments to bend his head close to the water. "Edith," said Mr. Penguin, "what is Gordon doing?" "Oh, don't worry about him," cried Edith. "He's having a nice time. I think he spotted his reflection and is listening for it to say something." Mr. Penguin had a few questions to ask about that, but just at that moment, the mayor of Cityville marched onto the deck, drawing her cardigan tightly around herself. "I thought we were meant to be sailing south for warmer weather," she said. "I'm blimmin' freezing." It was actually a bit cold. If he hadn't been full of fish finger sandwiches, Mr. Penguin would have nipped to his cabin to zip himself into his cagoule. Beside him, Edith sat up, licked her finger and put it in the air. Mr. Penguin knew that was Edith's trick to tell exactly what direction they were going in. "How strange," she said, puzzlement making her wrinkly face wrinkle more than usual. "We don't seem to be going south at all. In fact, we seem to be going in completely the opposite direction." Then immediately after that, something very dangerous happened. What's going to happen next?